You walked in and the smell hit you first. Not the sharp chemical bite of a supermarket. Not the synthetic neutrality of a clothing chain. Something warmer, older, the dry, faintly woody scent of thousands of printed pages layered floor to ceiling, pressed close enough that you could feel the weight of them around you. Classical music drifted from somewhere above. The light was soft, and you had nowhere else you needed to be. If you walked into a Borders books and music store in the 1990s, in Ann Arbor or Atlanta, or suburban Chicago or downtown Manhattan, you already know exactly what that felt like. You remember the wide carpeted aisles, the reading chairs set beside tables of new releases, the listening stations where you could slip on headphones and sample a CD before you bought it. You remember the staff, people who actually read. Who could name 3 books you'd love before you finished describing the last one you'd enjoyed. At its peak, in 2003, Borders Group operated 1,249 stores across the United States, the United Kingdom, Singapore, and Australia. It employed nearly 35,000 people worldwide. Its flagship superstore in Ann Arbor covered 40,000 square feet across 2 floors, stocking more than 128,000 book titles and 57,000 music recordings. Its highest-grossing location, a remodeled store in Puerto Rico, generated $17 million in sales in a single year. In 1997, Borders' sales per square foot reached an all-time high of $261. Publishers called its inventory system the envy of the industry. They survived being a 2-room upstairs shop with a commode tucked behind the service counter. They survived the collapse of the dot-com bubble that killed their sister company. They survived Kmart. They survived repeated changes of leadership, the death of the CD, and the arrival of the Internet. They adapted, expanded, and kept building, until they became the second-largest bookstore chain in the United States. And then, after 40 years of selling books, Borders filed for bankruptcy on the 16th of February 2011. By September of that year, every single one of its 399 remaining American stores had closed its doors for the last time. 10,700 jobs gone. How does the most innovative bookstore chain in America end up handing the keys to its future directly to the competitor that would destroy it, and then celebrate the deal with a bottle of champagne? What really happened inside those walls between the day 2 shaggy-haired brothers opened an 800-square-foot used bookshop above a guitar studio, and the September morning the last register went dark? In February of 1971, 2 young men from Louisville, Kentucky, rented the upper half of a converted house on South State Street in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and opened a used bookshop with no employees, no investor capital, and no business plan worth the name. The address was 211 South State Street. Below them, on the same floor, were Herb David's guitar studio and the Suwannee Spring leather shop. The conversion to commercial space was recent and imperfect. The floor plan included a service counter with the commode tucked directly behind it. The store had to close temporarily if anyone needed to use it. Tom Borders was the older brother. Born in Louisville around 1947, he had studied English literature at the University of Michigan. Louis Borders was younger, born around 1949, and had taken a different path. He studied mathematics at Michigan, then continued at MIT. While in Boston, he worked in a bookshop, and the experience crystallized an idea that a bookstore, run intelligently, could be something far more interesting. In 1970, Louis wrote to Tom with 2 suggestions. The first was a scheme to computerize the daily racing form's statistics. Tom dismissed it immediately. The second was to open a small used bookshop. Tom was more receptive. Both had degrees from Michigan, and both loved the atmosphere of Ann Arbor. They built the bookcases and displayed tables themselves, working for a month before the opening. They made hot tea every morning for the customers. That autumn, they had heard about a major estate auction in Boston where thousands of books were going under the hammer. They went. Tom met a dealer named Richard Mills, a man with a near photographic memory for the printed word. Mills bought an entire lot for $8,000. Tom rented a truck and moved the books to Mills' home. It was this encounter that set the character of Borders' bookshop from the beginning. The University of Michigan community responded. Graduate students came, faculty came. The store manager Joe Gable saw it as a cathedral of books. Classical music played continuously. Staff were expected to know the stock in depth. The shop was barely a business, but it was already, unmistakably, a place. The real revolution at Borders happened not on the shop floor but in the basement, and most of the customers who loved the store never knew it existed. In the mid-1970s, as the Ann Arbor shop grew, expanding first to a nearby space at 303 South State Street, into the old Wagner and Son men's clothing store, Louis Borders began working on something that had no precedent in the bookselling world. Working alone, sketching initial designs on legal pads, he developed a computerized inventory system using rented nighttime access to an IBM System 3. A piece of hardware originally designed for auto parts tracking. He adapted it from first principles to manage book inventory. The system was built on a core insight that sounds simple in retrospect, but was genuinely radical for retail in 1975. It tracked which books were actually selling by title and used that data to predict what needed to be restocked before it ran out. Not what the sales rep said was popular, not what the publishers were pushing. What the specific customers of this specific store were actually buying week by week, season by season. Louis created tailored subject categories that reflected Ann Arbor's progressive academic community: women's studies, gay studies, ecology, linguistics. He analyzed sales patterns in underrepresented areas and stocked accordingly. The result was a store that seemed, to customers, to anticipate their interests. Because it did. By the early 1980s, the shop had grown so large that it had become, almost by accident, a superstore. The formula the brothers had stumbled upon was counterintuitive but precise. The larger the store, the wider the selection, the further people drove to reach it. The further they drove, the more they spent. And the more they spent, the higher the sales per square foot. A bookshop that stocked everything was more profitable than one that stocked only the obvious. In 1985, they opened a prototype full superstore in Beverly Hills, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit. It worked. By 1988, with 5 stores operating and the wholesale division to be called Book Inventory Systems, or BIS, generating income from 14 independent bookstore clients. The brothers' combined enterprise was bringing in net income of $1.9 million from sales of $32.3 million. The inventory system was, by this point, the envy of the industry, as one publisher would later describe it to the Ann Arbor press. It was entirely proprietary. No patents were filed. It was the beating heart of everything Borders did. The reason the right book was always on the shelf. The reason the staff could find what you wanted even when you couldn't quite describe it. The reason the store felt improbably like it knew you. The brothers had not planned to build a national chain. They had planned to read and write and be intellectuals. The machine in the basement changed everything. In 1988, recognizing that they needed professional management to grow beyond the Midwest, the brothers recruited Robert F. Di Romualdo. He was a Harvard MBA and a graduate of Drexel, a man who knew how to turn a regional brand into a national one. Di Romualdo became president and CEO in 1989. He opened 14 new stores in the next 3 years. By 1992, Borders had quadrupled in size. It was at this moment, precisely when the company was at its most valuable, its most vibrant, that something shifted. Something that could not be undone. Walk into a Borders books and music superstore in 1996, and you entered a world that did not feel like retail. It felt like a destination. The typical superstore occupied around 30,000 square feet. The ceilings were high enough to breathe. The shelves were deep and wide and full, stocked with an average of 128,000 book titles. Every major publisher, every small press, every category from academic philosophy to regional cookbooks. In the music section, listening stations lined the walls. You would scan the barcode on an album cover, Elvis Costello, Lucinda Williams, Coltrane, Joni Mitchell, and press play on a small terminal, and the music would come through the headphones and you could decide right there whether you wanted it. Staff had often selected the featured tracks themselves. The cafes arrived in the mid-1990s. Seattle's Best Coffee, a brand Borders would eventually acquire a stake in TUI, operated kiosks and counters inside the stores. You could take your stack of shortlisted books to a small table, order a latte, and read for an hour before deciding what to buy. Nobody hurried you. Nobody suggested you were taking up space. The staff were the essential ingredient. Borders, in its best years, hired people who had actually read the books. In the application process for bookselling positions, candidates were tested on their literary knowledge. The store was organized into subject specialisms, and each section had an employee whose job was not just to stock and sell, but to know which new novel was worth the hardback price. Which history was the definitive account? Which cookbook had the recipe you'd been looking for since you saw it in a magazine 3 years ago? As one former employee recalled in an interview, "It was the most enjoyable job I have ever had. We had what makes any great bookstore great, a knowledgeable staff with a deep love of books." The stores also hosted events, author readings, live music, children's story hours. John Travolta visited. John Mayer performed. James Taylor appeared at the Ann Arbor flagship. The store at 5 World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan, 3 stories, with fiction occupying the entire first floor from Chinua Achebe to Louis Zukofsky, was, in the words of people who worked and shopped there, one of the most remarkable retail spaces in New York. Financially, the numbers were extraordinary. Revenue for Borders Group in 1995, its first year as a public company, trading on the New York Stock Exchange under the ticker BGP, was just shy of $1.6 billion. The superstores contributed $622.6 million of that, a 63% increase over the previous year. Sales in 1996 reached more than $2 billion. On the 4th of February, 1997, Borders' share price closed at an all-time high of $44.88. By 1997, The chain had 204 superstores, and its sales per square foot had reached their historic peak of $261. Most superstores became profitable within 12 months of opening. The model was working. The model was, by any measure, extraordinary. What almost nobody knew at the time, including, it seems, most of the people running the company, was that 1997 was the peak. Not just the peak for that year, the permanent, unreachable peak. Sales per square foot would never again reach that number. The company would keep opening stores for another decade. But the line on the graph had already turned. The signal when it came was easy to miss. In 1992, Tom and Louis Borders sold their company to Kmart Corporation for approximately $125 million. Kmart already owned Walden Books, a chain of smaller, mall-based bookstores that had been underperforming for years. The plan was to bundle Borders' operational brilliance with Walden Books' footprint, dress up the combined entity, and take it public. The brothers walked away. Tom relocated to Austin, Texas. Louis headed to Silicon Valley. They made no public statements about the sale. They would make almost none about what followed. What followed, almost immediately, was a culture war inside the company. Borders' senior staff did not fit inside Kmart's corporate structure. The people who had built the store around knowledge and taste found themselves inside a corporation whose instinct was to standardize, centralize, and drive down costs. Many of them left. Within months of the acquisition, Borders had lost a significant portion of its most experienced book buyers. Managers and subject specialists, the people who had made the inventory system meaningful. Because a database is only as intelligent as the people who feed it. De Romualdo and George McConaughey, who ran Kmart's specialty retail division, saw the problem. By 1995, they had executed a structured buyout. The IPO was managed by Goldman Sachs. The stock was listed on 2nd of May, 1995. The early results were exceptional. In November 1999, Borders Group hired a new CEO. His name was Greg Yosefovich. Yosefovich came from the food and drug retail sector. He had been president of Jewel Osco, a division of the grocery and pharmacy chain Albertsons. He had spent his career selling orange juice, shampoo, and paracetamol. He had never run a bookstore. He had never run anything even remotely like a bookstore. The Borders board hired him anyway. Phil Pfeffer, the experienced publishing executive who had briefly held the CEO role before him, had resigned after only 5 months. The board wanted someone with operational discipline. They got it. What they didn't get was someone who understood that selling books is not the same as selling sausage. Yosefovich was named chairman in January 2001. In the same month, he implemented a strategy called category management, a standard supermarket approach in which publishers, in exchange for promotional considerations, were allowed to shape entire sections of the stores. It reduced the authority of Borders' specialist book buyers. It favored large publishers and mass-market titles over the small press and independent voices that had defined the Borders' identity. Employees who had once had genuine autonomy over their sections found themselves stocking what the category managers dictated. In February 2001, Yosefovich eliminated the community relations coordinator positions at individual stores. The people whose job was to connect each Borders location to its local community through events, author visits, and relationships with schools and libraries. These were the people who made a national chain feel local. They were cut to save money. And then, in April 2001, Greg Yosefovich made the decision that would define his legacy and determine the fate of the company. Borders outsourced the management of its online retail operations to Amazon.com. At an August 2001 party near Borders' headquarters in Ann Arbor, Yosefovich brandished a bottle of champagne and announced that Amazon founder Jeff Bezos had sent a case to show his gratitude. The room celebrated. They were celebrating the moment they had handed the future of their company to their most dangerous competitor. The logic at the time seemed defensible. Borders had spent millions building its own website in the late 1990s, and the results had been underwhelming. Borders.com generated $27.4 million in sales in the fiscal year ending January 2001. Respectable, but not enough to justify the ongoing investment. The dot-com bubble had burst. Maintaining a full e-commerce operation while simultaneously rolling out more physical superstores looked like an expensive distraction. Amazon was already dominant online. Let them handle it. What this decision actually did was hand Amazon something far more valuable than a revenue stream. It handed them Borders customer data. Every online purchase that a Borders customer made, every search, every click, every abandoned cart, went into Amazon's database, not Borders. Amazon learned what Borders customers wanted. Borders remained ignorant of its own customer base's behavior online. For 7 years, until 2008, when George Jones finally ended the arrangement, Amazon ran Borders.com. 7 years of customer intelligence, 7 years of relationship building, 7 years during which Amazon learned in precise detail how to serve the people who were still walking into Borders stores. Morris Rosenthal, an industry analyst who observed the partnership closely, called it a fiasco. The word is insufficient. In fiscal 2003, Yosefovich earned a base salary of $710,000, supplemented by bonuses. He continued to collect a salary until he announced his retirement in early 2006, though he was only 53 years old. A subsequent consulting contract paid him $2.5 million over 2 years. He never gave a substantive public interview about what happened. Between 2001 and 2011, Borders Group cycled through 6 chief executives. Each one arrived with a new plan. Each plan contradicted the one before it. Each departure left the company weaker, more indebted, and less capable of the adaptation that might have saved it. George Jones replaced Yosefovich in July 2006, inheriting a company that had already been losing ground for 5 years. Jones moved quickly on several fronts. He ended the Amazon arrangement and began rebuilding Borders' own online presence. He divested most of the international operations. He began reducing the music inventory as CD sales continued to collapse. He also made a serious error. Under pressure to cut costs and service an expanding debt load, he dramatically slashed the inventory in the superstores, reducing the selection and breadth of titles that had always been the chain's defining advantage. In the final holiday season under his leadership, 2008, sales fell 11.7% to $868.8 million. Jones was fired in January 2009. The year 2009 was the company's 4th consecutive year without an annual profit. Borders had not turned a profit since 2006. In the 4 fiscal years between 2007 and 2011, it would lose $605 million. The balance sheet was a ruin. The company had borrowed $42.5 million from Pershing Square Capital Management at an interest rate of 12.5%. It was the financial equivalent of using a credit card to pay the mortgage. By 2009, average sales per square foot at Borders superstores had sunk to $173. That was down from the 1997 peak of $261. The stores were the same size. The overhead was the same. The revenue was not. The e-book revolution arrived and Borders was not in it. Amazon launched the Kindle in November 2007. Barnes & Noble launched the Nook in October 2009. Borders launched its own e-reader, the Kobo, in June 2010. It arrived 3 years after the market had already been defined by competitors. Once again, Borders had outsourced the future. Once again, it had handed its digital customers to someone else. By the end of 2010, the stores were visibly struggling. Inventory was thin. Staff had been cut. The payroll of the Ann Arbor headquarters, which had once employed more than 1,200 people, was down to around 600. Publishers had begun hearing that Borders was delaying payments on inventory already received. That was not a negotiating tactic. That was a warning sign that the company could not pay its bills. By July 2011, it was over. The Chapter 11 process had not found a buyer. An auction was scheduled for the 17th of July. The deadline expired without a single qualified offer. On the 18th of July 2011, Borders Group filed the paperwork to convert its bankruptcy from a Chapter 11 reorganization into a Chapter 7 liquidation. The judge was Martin Glenn of the United States Bankruptcy Court in New York. He approved the petition. It was the end. Mike Edwards, who had become CEO of the subsidiary Borders Incorporated in early 2010 and had spent more than a year fighting to keep the company alive, was in New York that day. He was there to submit a final reorganization plan. He thought it was 90% done. At 5 o'clock the evening before he was due to appear before the judge, he was told it was over. He filed for liquidation instead. When Edwards and then CFO Scott Henry returned to Borders headquarters on Phoenix Drive in Ann Arbor, they were met by hundreds of employees who applauded them for 20 minutes. "We were there, fighting for the team," Edwards later said. There was a lot of pride in the brand. It was by any measure one of the more heartbreaking scenes in recent American corporate history. On the 22nd of July, 2011, Borders began the phased closure of its remaining 399 stores. By September 2011, the last stores were shutting their doors. Liquidation sales started immediately in all locations. By September 2011, the last stores were shutting their doors. In Ann Arbor, the flagship store, known inside the company as Store Number 1, was one of the last to close. It occupied 40,000 square feet of the former Jacobson's department store. For 23 years, it had been the heart of downtown Ann Arbor's cultural life, hosting authors, musicians, and the kind of extended, unhurried browsing that the internet has never fully replicated. Veteran employee Sharon Gambin pointed out to the liquidators that there were unsold books by Barbara Kingsolver and Michael Pollan in the back stockroom. The liquidator gave them a prominent placement, and they sold out within days. It was a small moment, but it illustrated what had always been true. The people in the stores knew what the books were worth. The people in the corporate offices in the final decade did not. The last customers drifted out with their marked-down books. The lights went out. The shelves were stripped. The signs were taken down. Barnes & Noble acquired Borders' trademark and other intellectual property at auction in September 2011. They paid $13.9 million for a brand that had, at its peak, generated $4 billion. The total job losses numbered 10,700 people. Most were in their 30s and 40s. Many had spent their entire adult working lives inside those stores. What almost nobody reported at the time was the degree to which the Walden Books inheritance distorted every decision Borders made in its final decade. More than 1,000 small stores, mostly in failing malls, each signed to a long lease, each consuming cash. The tail was wagging the dog. The legacy asset was devouring the future. Today, the building at 612 East Liberty Street in downtown Ann Arbor has been subdivided into restaurants and office space. It looks prosperous and functional. The address where it all began, 211 South State Street, Kew, is today occupied by a CVS pharmacy. There is no plaque, no marker. The inventory system that Louis Borders built in a basement on a rented IBM computer has no direct descendants inside any bookstore chain. It died with the culture. The Book Industry Charitable Foundation, known as BINC, was started by Borders employees in 1996 to help booksellers facing financial emergencies. When the BORDERS letters were removed from the front of the Ann Arbor flagship, the building's owners donated them to BINC to be sold as fundraising items. Thousands of former Borders employees across America joined a Facebook group called Borders Class of 2011 and Before. They exchanged memories of Harry Potter release parties. The tone was not angry. It was the tone of people who had loved something and lost it, and were trying to hold on to the shape of what it had been. The people who worked in those stores deserved better. They had been given something remarkable to be part of, a workplace that took knowledge seriously. And then, above their heads, a sequence of decisions had been made by people who did not understand what they were managing, and the remarkable thing was allowed to end. The responsibility is not simple. It does not rest on one person or one decision. It rests on the Kmart acquisition. It rests on Yosefovich's failure. It rests on the Amazon deal. It rests on the decade of overexpansion that buried the company in long-term leases it could not service when the music died. It rests on the board. But it also rests on a market that was changing faster than almost anyone anticipated, and on the specific cruelty of a business model that was beloved and structurally vulnerable. There was every chance this company could have survived. There were people inside it at every level who knew what it needed to do. Someone chose, again and again, not to let them do it. And so what remains, on South State Street in Ann Arbor, is a CVS. What remains on East Liberty is a ramen restaurant and a steakhouse. What remains in the memory of every person who ever spent a Saturday afternoon in one of those stores is something that has not been replaced, and probably cannot be. We'd like to know where you were when Borders closed. If you worked there, at any location, in any role, tell us what you remember in the comments. The comments section is where this story continues. If you found value in this documentary, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps more people find these stories. And if you know someone who remembers Borders, share this with them. Because the stores are gone, but the people who loved them are still here.